This meeting is being recorded.
All right, right on. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your time and your attention and your insights to this process. Ian, I see you've just joined. We've shared the notes document where we will be working through the agenda, and we've also linked to all the other key documents. I want to welcome everybody and have a very quick go round of introductions. You know, basically your name, your organization, and how you're feeling today. We won't get into much more than that to save time. One or two words on how you're feeling. We don't need to hear a whole paragraph. Then I'll give some context for this kickoff of the work group, and we'll dive right into essentially agenda setting for the work group's work together. And you can see that agenda sketched out on this document. We will pause to make sure that this reflects your expectations. If you have any suggestions, feel free to start adding them into the chat or the comments, and I'll start following along. Otherwise, just get ready to have a pithy contribution. Okay, so with that said, Greg Bloom, I lead the Open Referral Initiative. I am thrilled to be restarting this process. I know that was more than 2 words. I apologize for poorly modeling my own instructions. All right, who can go next? I can call on folks. Sarah, thank you, by the way, Sarah and Ayers, for hosting us in the Zoom.
No problem. My name is Sarah Paulberg. I am Ayers staff, Alliance of Information and Referral Systems, and excited to be here.
Right on. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Greg. Mike Thacker from Pourism Limited. We developed the UK extension to HSDS 1 and have supported it here since. Feeling okay. It's a Monday, but just getting going.
Right on. I'll stick on that side of the pond. Paul, welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, I'm Paul Brown. I work for an organisation called a company called PlaceCube. Here in the UK, we've worked quite closely with both Mike and Ian, implementing the Open Referral UK standard for a number of customers. And similarly to Mike, just recovering from a 4-day public holiday. So we're just getting back going into the work mode.
Welcome back. Ian, welcome.
Welcome me. I mean, sorry. Thanks, Greg. I'm feeling, that's just giving an example, I'm feeling a bit flustered. I've just rushed back from Blackburn for a workshop, so I don't feel well prepared. I'm Ian Singleton. I work for a company called Digital Gaps, and we're focused on implementing the Open Referral Standard. Right on. Thank you for joining us. No worries about being flustered or otherwise unprepared. We're going to prepare together. Let's see, Rob and then David.
Yeah, I'm Rob from Open Data Services Co-op. We've been involved in Open Referral for many years, particularly around the technical aspects of the standard itself. And I'm just really excited to see this many people here to talk about standards upgrade. The last one, I felt like I somewhat did on my own.
Right on, welcome. David.
Yeah, hello, I'm David from Open Data Services, and I've currently been working on sort of the FHIR like mapping between HSDS and FHIR, and I've been working in Open Data Centers for a long time, and I'm had the whole of last week off at a wedding, so I'm feeling fairly flaky today as well.
Right on. Welcome. And Tim Hill from the Open Data Institute, and Tim is helping us with notes. Tim, sorry to take your intro from yourself.
That was what I was going to say. I'll just add that I'm glad to see somebody from Alberta on the call. It's my home province. Haven't been there for a while.
Right on. Okay, back to the United States. Devin, welcome. You're on mute.
Hi, Devin, in New York. Longtime Open Referral participant and developer, or at least producer of various Open Referral HSDS software systems. Probably most significantly the Airtable template and the OR services directory app, which powers uses HSDS 2.0. You can manage the directory via Airtable through a sync or via in backend, etc. So it's a monolithic app. It's underused.
I don't think it's underused. I think we are going to see more use in the future. Perhaps it's fair to say it's underused. I appreciate Devin's work on this.
In use.
Thank you.
In use,
in use.
Underutilized. It is being utilized by numerous numerous people.
Right. And just to clarify, Devin and Mike have drafted the initial proposals that we'll be reviewing together. Thank you, Devin and Mike, for your work. Let's see, Kate Lambacker.
Hi, Kate Lambacker. I am the developer for the OpenCF project, which is I think it was 1999 that started. So I've been working on that for over 20 years, and we've been doing data exchange for about 20 years now. And that's sort of what I bring to the table is 20 years of mangling data together.
Right on. Thank you for your expertise. Shelby.
Hi, y'all. I am a fellow currently at the Beck Center in DC, and I've been involved with Open Referral for, I guess, almost 5 years now, helping with some contribution on the open source software side. And generally, I'm a software engineer, but community organizer as well, and open source activist. Right on.
Thank you so much. I think I've gotten everybody. It's super exciting to have this wealth of experience and insight on the call. Thank you all for your time and joining. Sorry, I didn't mention this earlier. I've added my preferred pronouns to my name. You can adjust your name and indicate your preferred pronouns if you wish by clicking the 3 dots and then the rename option. I will walk quickly through just some scene setting for this group, and then we can dive further into the agenda. To clarify, this is, I think, the 4th or 5th iteration of essentially a minimally viable approach to governance that we've taken over the last 8 or so years in Open Referral, in which we essentially form, rather than a sort of formal governing body with standing committee and chairs and whatnot, we form ad hoc work groups as the need arises through our development process. That may change in the future, but for right now, this is merely the most recent iteration of a process running since 2014, in which we have a work group that consists of people who are either subject matter experts in the field of information and referral and resource directory information management, and or implementers who are maybe developing software or system integrations and whatnot, or other subject matter experts that we convene in a work group to review proposals and offer input to a set of technical stewards who in this instance are the Open Data Services Co-op. They've been serving that role since 2015. They are sort of the ones who receive input from our designated set of experts and stakeholders, draft proposals for that set of stakeholders to review, and then formalize the outputs of that process. This iteration is going to be a little bit different in that we have a set of proposals that have come from implementers directly, primarily Devin and Mike in dialogue with others, such as those on the call. Those proposals are on the table. This process will review those proposals, offer any feedback for iterating upon them, and then provide instructions for the Open Data Services Cooperative to act upon in formalizing the outputs of this work group. I have included a link to the proposal, which is about to, on this call, become the sort of agreed upon policies. I have reached out to y'all in advance to see, like, does anybody have any other suggestions? We've gotten a lot of input. I think this document reflects what everybody expects. I'm hoping we can take a brief moment to review it, ask any final questions. I don't expect any surprises, but if you do have an issue that suddenly has occurred to you, you want to let us know so we can discuss it. There's one or two things in the proposal that we will review as to how we are going to work together on the spot, and then otherwise this will be sort of for reference moving forward. And then once we've done that, we will review the agenda for our work together overall. There's a set of proposals on the table. There may be other things that we can add to our agenda. There will be a set of things that we rule out of scope, but can develop recommendations for action in the future. So we will review that work group agenda together. And then we'll talk briefly about how we will do our work together moving forward. What's our plan for the cadence of this work group? How we'll manage like specific topics of interest that we want to go deep on, and then we'll wrap up this call with some thoughts on next steps. Any questions about that agenda overall? Okay, cool. So the first proper item for us to discuss is the proposal for the work group, which I'm hoping we can turn into an agreed upon framework at this point. I have one or two questions remaining, specifically around like what do we consider quorum and what do we expect to be our cadence. We'll loop back to the cadence question once we've talked through the various issues in the agenda. Basically, the idea here to summarize this document is you all, this is a voluntary group. We do want it to be semi-formal. So you've been formally invited by either myself or the lead proposal authors, Devin and Mike. You all can step back formally, but up until that point, we do expect you to attend as many of the meetings as possible. We will be, I will be co-facilitating along with the Open Data Institute, represented by Tim Hill, who will be playing the role of secretariat with notes taking and increasingly playing more roles of coordination and follow-up. And the Open Data Services Co-op will be offering formal feedback on the proposal for this work group to work through, and receiving feedback from the work group to develop any final revisions to the proposed upgrades. To clarify, technically, I and Tim and the Open Data Services Co-op, we don't have strong substantive opinions on the content of the specification. Open Data Services Co-op may offer their opinions, but this is essentially like we are here to steward the process by which the stakeholders will weigh in, the subject matter experts and implementers on this call will weigh in. So to the extent that we have opinions, we couch them as such, but ultimately we expect the group to reach consensus, or on issues that the group does not fully reach consensus, we will try to find a path forward that copes with the lack of agreement. So far, there's in all 8 years only been 1 or 2 instances in which we haven't readily reached consensus on this or that matter. If that does happen, we do, as a leadership team, reserve the right to make a decision that moves past consensus, documenting the reasons for that decision. We reserve the right to make a decision that moves past the lack of consensus. We will then document the reasons for that decision, the criteria by which that decision can be revisited in the future. This is a way for us to both ensure that people have the ability to work together to reach alignment, and also make sure that we can still move forward in the face of anybody who maybe picks a position and really sticks with it and isn't able to find some sort of compromise position. Like I said, that's only happened once or twice in 8 years. And we still ended up walking away with everybody more or less feeling heard, and more or less feeling like their perspective was accounted for in our documentation. Any questions about what you see in this work group document, this work group framework? Okay. No questions so far. There's one about like what do we expect in terms of quorum, right? At what point, what do we expect to be minimally possible in terms of attendance of work group members in order to say we had a work group meeting? I'd like to say we have, I think, 7 work group members. I'd like to say, normally I'd say 2/3. It's not quite an even number. So maybe, I'd start with 5, but if people have strong opinions on this one way or another, please let us know. Otherwise, maybe 5 is okay.
I suggest an odd number.
Okay. All right. We're going with 5. Okay. We'll still have questions about the cadence. We'll loop back to that at the end of this. Otherwise, unless I hear any other questions or suggestions with regards to this document, we'll consider this done. Great. Moving on. Okay, so reviewing and prioritizing the work group agenda. So this is not just our agenda for today, but our agenda for the next 3-4 or so months of work together. So we have a set of proposals that are linked above from Devin and Mike. I'd like to offer Devin and Mike a chance to provide some, verbal narrative about these proposals in a moment. One of my questions, basically when Devin and Mike came and said we had proposals that we want to put together for an upgrade to the specification with 1 or 2 specific objectives that they want to achieve. Those are pretty narrow objectives. At the time we discussed, would this be a narrow sort of minor upgrade? And that is provisionally our expectation is that this is a process that will go from HSDS 2.0 to HSDS 2.1, which means there will be no major revisions that we expect to happen in this process. This is a matter of extension and specification rather than structural change. That is still my expectation, although I do want to leave some room for possibility that there does become agreement that there needs to be some sort of structural change. I don't want to rule it out that this might be an opportunity to go from 2.0 to 3.0. That I'm not psyched about that possibility, but it's not it's not a hill I'm going to die on. If you all really do look at the materials and say we actually want to make some changes that are structural, I'm leaving open that possibility. But otherwise, the expectation is we align on the things that are minor and that are urgent to upgrade with regards to especially alignment between the core spec and purpose-driven versions of the specification. And if there are significant content issues, potentially structural issues that arise in that process, the work group is empowered to make recommendations for a roadmap and for a future agenda that might take those issues on and offer guidance to implementers who might be dealing with those issues, but not try to directly address them within the specification. Any questions about that framing in terms of what it is we do and don't expect to be doing during this work group? We can briefly, Mike and Devin, let's hear from you all just a quick 2-minute overview or 3-minute overview of the proposals that you've put together. I think they're pretty well documented, but it'd be great to just hear them verbally from you. And then let's talk about given your overview, can we check our assumptions about what consists of a major versus a minor revision in order to firm up that expectation of our scope? Mike, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, just to start by saying in the UK, Open Referral UK was a formal extension of HSDS 1. So we added things, we didn't take away anything that was mandated. And we said which of the optional fields we thought was relevant to our situation. HSDS 2 actually adopted some of our UK recommendations, but didn't necessarily adopt them using the same terminology and naming. And as a result, ceased to be back a true extension and backwards compatible. We would like to address that in this version by having one full extended HSDS that we're all agreed on, all using the same terminology, and then take cuts of that, which I've called application profiles, to apply to specific circumstances. one of which could be getting back to HSDS 2.01 as it is now, and another could be getting back to the Open Referral UK structure as it is now. But there are other possibilities, including Devon's proposal that we have a core tables, which is a kind of cut down minimum version of Open Referral, which does the basics, but doesn't bring in a lot of the complications which might confuse people in a simple implementation. So what we've done is we've got one big Google spreadsheet of everything that's in the US and the UK versions, and we've identified where the naming is different, and we've identified any issues, and we've suggested what should be in the extended version, which is essentially what's in either that is genuinely used. So there are a few things that were in the UK version that were good in theory, but not in practice, which we're suggesting we drop. But the rest we're suggesting we include. And we've also added things which have come from feedback in the US and the UK, particularly from people like Ian and Paul on this call, who've been implementing live implementations and come back with real user feedback. And indeed, the PlaceCube product has some things which might be considered for general use. So we've suggested all of these, and it's a question for these work groups as to how far we go in implementing them. So we need to consider each of those changes one by one. Some will be controversial, some won't. But I'd also like at some point in the agendas, in the sequence of meetings, to look at the actual methodology we apply for coming up with these application profiles from the core. So we've got a definitive way of defining that. So if somebody else wants to create their own application profile, whether we put it on the Open Referral site or not, they're using the same methodology as we're using, and everyone can understand it. And rippling out of that come things like what the structure of your API responses should look like. It's all rules driven once we've got the structure correct. So I'm hoping we can go through that through the meetings. And just finally on the what's a major and what's a minor version upgrade, because I know Rob has said a bit on this. Strictly speaking, a major upgrade is anything that's not backwards compatible. I'd like to think if we got the type of a field wrong in the last version, we can fix it in this one without calling it a major upgrade. But there are things, and particularly Skylar has suggested that we might come up with an amalgamation of the locations and the postal locations and the physical locations tables. I think there's a 3-table structure for that we might simplify. That would be a minor change. And somewhere in the process, we need to address whether or not we want to attack that now or later, or if we've got a mechanism for finding out who would care if we made such a major change. Thank you.
Right on. So we'll loop back to some of the issues that you brought up. I also want to hear briefly from Devon, who co-authored these proposals. Devon, is there anything you'd like to add to Mike's framing there?
Very well articulated by Mike. My role is mostly as a cheerleader and also as the implementer of software. Mike's really driven this with a lot of input from Skylar. Only thing I'd add, just for emphasis, is that the UK community has built a lot of great tools that, as like an implementer and as someone who deals with open referral related projects, I'm certainly jealous of and want to be able to use. And so, the number one reason for all of this, in my opinion, is being able to align the UK and US community, aggregate tools, move our data, use the same tools with HSDS data. And so like tier 1, absolutely necessary, is just getting US and UK aligned. Tier 2, I think, is just improving the standard, which is a process that is and should be an ongoing process. But I think we have a bunch of great recommendations in there for how to improve the standard. But getting the US and UK aligned by adopting what's been proposed, and adopting an application profile approach where, you know, many different groups can use open referral structure and fields in different ways and document that is, I think, going to really accelerate the technical development and the community growth.
Right on. Thank you very much to both of you for your work and for your help in framing this up. I'll just briefly recap. We have 3 documents that they've submitted. One is a narrative document. That's the first one, aligning Open Referral and Open Referral UK. Another is a spreadsheet that I think contains the specific schematic comparative analyses that are referenced by that narrative document. And then Mike, you've also offered a proposed version control process that we can review, which gets out of the technical specs and into the governance. I will also add there something that's specified in the workgroup document. This workgroup, our expectation is that it will offer recommendations that support the upgrade process, and then it will be done. It will subset, but this workgroup is also encouraged to develop recommendations for governance, potentially, like specifically of the specification, although your recommendations can also extend to governance of the initiative overall. So that is one of the expectations, is that you all can go through this process and tell us how our process should run in the future. And much like everything else, if we have a consensus opinion about something, you are empowered essentially to make a binding recommendation that I will take and implement, just like the recommendations for the technical specifications go to Open Data Services Co-op for implementation. On that note, I will add one more thing that I forgot to put on the agenda, which is that related to this, Rob and the Open Data Services Co-op team and I have been restructuring the Open Referral documentation. We've developed a staging site for proposed for essentially new documentation. This reflects 2.0, but the 2.1 would potentially be formatted into this format as well. You can review this. I just added it to the key link section. Sorry that I didn't get to it before. The menu has been reorganized, and also the project documentation explaining like how is the whole initiative governed and so on and so forth has been brought into this document. So rather than Google Docs here and GitHub over there, we now have one set of documentation, or at least we're proposing it. And so you all are also encouraged to offer feedback that can help improve this documentation before it goes formally live. Okay, so I will pause there and have us do essentially a go round. What I'd like, not everybody has to talk, but I want to give everybody the chance to talk. And what we want to hear is like your list of questions and comments and observations. Let's just take stock for now of those questions, and then we can review. There might be some that we can answer right off the bat, and there might be some questions that help us set our agenda moving forward. So let's take about 10 minutes or so to hear from everyone. After about 10 minutes, if we're still going, I'm going to start working us to try to close it up so that we have 15 minutes at the end of the hour to think through the process from here. Who would like to go first with your reactions, questions, suggestions, etc., that can help us shape our agenda moving forward? And we'll just, again, we won't be getting into back and forth on those questions unless there's something that is immediately answerable. We will just be taking stock of what questions people have.
I'm happy to kick it off. I have a slight cold, so I apologize for that. I'm super excited about this. I do have a small sticky wicket, which I think is going to kind of exemplify this question of, do we make small breaking changes or not? And it's that technically I've run into a number of issues where having field names that are the same as table names, as with eligibility or service area, have created a real problem in some modern technology stacks. And that was one. It's in a GitHub issue. I believe it's referenced in the spreadsheet as well, next to service area. That would be a little something where it's kind of like, it's not a big change, but it is a breaking change. How do we want to handle that? And then I'm just so excited to see this group together. So this is going to be awesome.
Right on. Thank you, Skylar. We've added that. We will add this to the list. Really appreciate that contribution. Who else would like to follow Skylar?
I can go ahead. Just around the breaking changes, it's better to do that as early as possible. I mean, I know we're not early at this point, but if you know there's a problem, the longer you wait to address it, just the worse it will be, especially with more people adopting it and so on. And so if you recognize an issue, it's better to go through the pain and have it over with if the pain is sufficient. So I don't think we should be afraid to do that. And there's often ways to mitigate the pain, but it's just better to get that pain out of the way, honestly. If that's what makes sense in the long term, you have to have an eye to the long term. I would really like to go through, I'm looking at this spreadsheet. I would really like to go through it with eyeballs on what's going on here. There's a brand new set of standards that have come out for 211 in Ontario. I would like to see how this meshes. There are certain things I think we've discussed in previous iterations that are already kind of problematic in the Canadian context. But we just didn't have anyone really making use of this, that it was worth making a ton of noise about those issues, right? But you're kind of preventing yourself from adoption to some degree, as long as there are lingering things that are problematic for what's going on here. Even simple things like the text saying languages other than English. If you're in an actual bilingual country, that is problematic wording, right? It can be what seem like minor things, but once you're going outside primarily English countries, then little things like that can be different. Or geography is a slightly different issue to the US and UK. So I would like to at least have those things documented and noted, and have the group understand where some of those standards put pressure internationally. It's worth doing that, even if those changes aren't adopted this go round.
Right on. Thank you, Kate, so much. I agree on multiple fronts. First of all, I had conversations that you've brought to our attention fully in mind when Devin and Mike came to me and said, we need an extension methodology that's more formal to support the UK's variations. I was like, yes, this sounds like the kind of thing that Kate was bringing to our attention about Canada's address conventions and so on. So we do have an assumption that the methodology that we're proposing for profiling would enable, like Canada, to have a profile that specifies here's our extensions that work for us. That said, with your other point in mind that, if there is a problem that does need to be addressed, it's better to address it earlier than later. I'm leaving open the possibility that you all might come to consensus that there ought to be changes that are considered essentially breaking. So didn't want to rule it out entirely, even though I did at least do that with my instructions to Devin and Mike when they came to me for an initial proposal, but you all are empowered to go beyond that scope if you come to agreement that it is important. Okay, who's next? Thank you, Kate.
I haven't got much to add at this stage, but what I would say is I totally agree with what Kate's just said in terms of if we're going to make large changes, better to do it sooner rather than later. That's for sure, in our experience anyway.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else?
Sure, I'll go. So yeah, I think for me, I'll introduce Matt briefly. He's another one of my colleagues. I've pointed downwards, he's below me on my screen. He'll be doing a lot of the sort of data and data structure work around this on our side, I think. So our job in this, we work across a whole bunch of different data standards. And the really exciting thing about doing this and addressing these questions now is that we've been through a whole bunch of other standards addressing these questions in the past. And we hopefully have at least better ways of navigating it, even if we don't have better technical solutions yet. And so hopefully through the course of this, we'll be able to come up with some, knowing me, probably massively overcomplicated to start with, but I have colleagues to pull me back and simplify things. Yeah, we have ways of approaching this, and I've got a ton of ideas of how we can approach a whole bunch of these things. I won't go into details now, but yeah, I agree completely. This is stuff we've carried with us for a long time, and to deal with it now sounds great.
Right on. For those, if folks don't have anything to contribute yet, it may be because you haven't yet had a chance to read through the materials. I didn't want to assume that everybody had a chance to read through all the materials before this call, even though we do expect that ASAP. If anybody has questions about what you have read, please let us know. Otherwise, we just want to kick this off to support what will be a more substantive set of discussions moving forward. Anybody else with questions based on, given what you've read in the proposals or about the process?
I can say something quickly. I'm sort of very interested in like how we do the extension mechanism and to like, add that stuff, because that needs to be formalized before we do other things. And working on with fire, which is interesting, they go about in a different way, and it is a big, massively complicated standard. But I've sort of got to grasp with how they do it, and they've got like millions of different extensions for different bits. So I'd like to feed back some of that potential approach, and it's sort of the opposite to how we've done it before, where they basically have like one big standard with like everything in it, but they have like profiles where they can strain it down for particular use cases, and that could suit open referral to a certain extent, and have a mechanism to give, like, for particular use cases, you have one that's completely compatible, but you just have like certain fields, and you can even restrict types that are less bounded than your current ones are, which is more or less. So I sort of want to put that into the mix based on the learnings from that.
And just to provide some context on this, FHIR is the fast healthcare interoperability resources established by HL7 for health information exchange. David, who is not a member of this work group formally, he is a member of Open Data Services Co-op along with Matt Marshall, are helping some folks in the US develop proposed alignment of Open Referral's HSDS with FHIR's protocols for healthcare provider directory information. And I expect like the UK profile of HSDS will be the first reference implementation for the methodology that you all land on, and FHIR very well may be like the second the second implementation of this profiling method. And so I'm looking forward to hear any insights that come out of that process. But mostly I think they're here to listen and learn. So Kate, I see your hand up. Let me see if anybody else has anything else to add before we go to Kate and then Rob.
I'll go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So I come from a dark past of interaction design, and which means that I always care about use cases, and not just use cases in the kind of throwaway, or we're thinking about users, kind of like, what are the interactions that people are wanting from this data? How are they going to be using it to complete their work? And I'm really excited about this idea of developing these methodologies for developing the profiles, because through that, I see that as, I don't like the word empowering, because people empower themselves, but that gives people the tools in order to say, this is my use case. I don't need to provide it to you. It means I can go about and do it myself. And that to me is a really positive thing to hear straight off the bat coming into this working group. So yeah, dead happy to be here. And then +1 to everything Kate said as well. That was really nice and critical.
Right on. Thank you, Matt. I've also added your suggestion of developing use cases, which is actually, we've heard requests from elsewhere. We have a set of user personas, but I don't know that we have a formal set of use cases that describe the actual actions that might be taken in implementations for this or that purpose that inform our choices at the specification level. Developing those use cases is something I'd like to see come out of this work group. So I've added that for us to discuss when it comes to what activities we expect this work group to take on. Okay, anybody else with any other contributions? Okay, not hearing any. Kate.
Okay, so this was just back to reflect, I don't know names yet, I'm sorry, to before, discussing taking a complete model. It sounded like filtering it, and I wanted to clarify if that's what was intended, and whether we're actually proposing a combination of filtering based profiles and extensions, or are we talking about one or the other, because they are very different beasts.
My expectation, good question. My expectation has been that a profile entails a set of extensions and or constraints for a specific use case, whether that use case is geographical, as in like use of the spec in the UK or Canada, or topical, as in use of the spec with fire systems, that the profile could potentially include both extensions, constraints, and also potentially enumerations or specific value sets. But let's pause here to check. And Kate, if you're saying that there are different considerations interoperability wise when it comes to profiling,
yeah. So I just want to elaborate a little bit more and then bring it back. So if you talk about putting as much as you can into the central standard, that allows you to hopefully minimize the tracks and maximize the compatibility. But then not everyone is going to want to conform at all of those levels. And so if you, I'll use that, I don't know how many of people on the call actually use the AIRS taxonomy, but I'll use their filter model as an example. So the AIRS taxonomy has more than 10,000 terms. People are not expected to use them all. It's too many. People are expected to take the grand standard and work it down to a local set that they implement. That applies to their local needs and how they do their work. But the fact that the overarching standard is a big umbrella under which all of these sort of more limited places operate, mean that there is a high level of compatibility because you're still drawing from the same pool, but they'll also have the ability to extend and create completely local terms that fall outside of what the AIRS taxonomy is willing to add, which is the extension. So you have both the filter and the extension. That is very different from the model of the least common minimum, in which you operate entirely on extension models. And it has very different implications for compatibility. So I think it's important to prioritize where you're cutting that off in terms of how much are you wanting to push in to the big standard, how much do you allow people to decide not to implement certain parts of it, making things not required, versus doing that least minimum standard and relying on formal extensions to build the structure that people need to cooperate on a larger set of data, right? I just think we should make that choice consciously and not unconsciously, where we could end up with chaos.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Rob, your hand went up before Kate spoke, but maybe you're able to speak to that, and it sounds like Mike also might be able to speak to it. Let's try to keep this brief and set us up for, if we can land on a position on this. I don't want to speak. I don't want to share my assumptions on this. I want to hear what you all say.
Sure. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few different ways we can break up how we think about this that could be really helpful. I said in the comment in the doc people can read about how we maybe want to give greater weight to some things that we consider. So we should give fundamental modeling of we model services and we model locations, and regardless of what's in those buckets, like they're pretty fundamental things. So that we should hold the most tightly. And things like the values of enums and the wording of documentation, we should probably hold more lightly, not nothing at all, but more lightly. That doesn't fit neatly into SEMVer that we've stolen from the software world, like standards. I'm going to say standards aren't software. There are many people who disagree with me on that, but standards aren't software. And you can, yeah, I see you, Shelby. It doesn't necessarily make sense to think in terms of the major minor patch thing. To a certain extent it does, but also maybe it doesn't. Implementers in the room might disagree on that as well. But that could be a helpful way of thinking about things you hold most tightly and things you hold more loosely, and that gives us a more nuanced way of discussing things. I think we should also think about interoperability and the ways in which people want to interoperate. Devin talked about the interoperability of tools. The requirements for that are quite different from the interoperability of data. Mike's got a great tool that I think is the most powerful thing I've seen in open data ever, of data source on one side, drop down, visualize when the other side, drop down, click go. It's incredible to demonstrate the value of standards. But unless you actually want to turn up in one city with an app written for a different continent's cities, that maybe doesn't matter too much. And certainly if you're trying to aggregate things, if you're trying to answer the question of service density in New York versus service density in Nottingham, that question doesn't make sense. Like that's so deeply embroiled into what is the service policy stuff that you can't answer that question. So why would you try and aggregate that data together? And I think when we talk about interoperability, thinking about that, and when we think about how we describe the model, thinking about that could really help us. And also might skirt around the whole V3 question. If you have 5 version numbers instead of just 3.
Okay. Mike, I see your hand up, and then let's see if we can wrap up this phase of the documentation. Kate, I see you kind of rejoining. That's okay. I do want us to have 10 minutes, so let's keep these brief because we want to set our plans for the months ahead.
I think we need separate sessions on both points Kate raised and the points that Rob raised. As far as yours, Kate, is concerned, I am primarily seeing the model as a filter model, not as a minimum and an extend, albeit a filter where you can impose extra rules like mandates of fields and particular taxonomies. And with a bit of extensibility, courtesy of what we're calling in HSDS2 service attributes. So I think we need, that's clear in my head, but that doesn't mean to say it's correct, but I'm clear as to what we were proposing, but we need to discuss that and see if people think that's sensible. So the considerations you raised, Kate, I'd like us to talk through in the meeting.
All right, Kate, do you want to sum up this conversation?
It's not going to take long. I basically say I think it's worth a discussion about ways to balance the practical needs of people who do have standards and real systems where they need to do those data crosswalks and things with trying to be super high level and non-prescriptive. Because in the real world where you're working with real data, you have to find a way to mesh these things together. And we need to, if you actually want people to use this in the real world, we have to consider those needs some way. So that is a way bigger discussion than now, but it's a really important one.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up on this phase, and we'll talk about what we expect moving forward. One of the things that's come out of this exchange that I think highlights to me something we already knew, but is sort of affirming it, is that we ought to develop a set of use cases that describe different kinds of users' needs, to Kate's point. So these are not necessarily use cases that describe end users using an application, so much as use cases that describe people who might be engineering software that needs to integrate with a third-party data source using these specs, and or working with data across multiple systems, and we'll want some documentation of our expectations of what those users' needs are, how they want to behave, and therefore like what needs to be addressed by the specification. So my thoughts for this group is, between now and our next session, which we want to talk through, we might be able to draft a set of priority use cases or review existing documentation. If you already have something that sounds like what I'm describing, I would welcome any contributions of something that already exists. And then substantively, we didn't really talk about the content of the proposals except for these issues. So between now and the next session, I hope that everybody can read through those proposals and identify any issues that you think the work group should address. And we can review those issues and sort of cluster based on what is urgent and what is, you know, potentially important, but not necessarily something that we're putting on our agenda for now. So that's my two thoughts about the outputs of this group, at least between now and the next meeting. Any thoughts about that? I'm going to go around and see if we can get folks to volunteer to, you know, play one of these roles. But any thoughts before I go on? Anything else that you think this work group should be working on? Okay. So my thinking here is that this work group will convene. We don't yet know, is this work group going to convene every other week or monthly? And then I assume
maybe let me just say something that I find just, you know, that I just want to voice kind of like a bit of my worry, which is great. I mean, I'm really happy here and we're all engaged in this conversation. You know, I'm just going to voice a worry, which is that, you know, myself, Mike, and Skylar, you know, spent, you know, we're all basically like professional software developers with users using Open Referral, and we've spent you know, many months going through and coming up with a set of very specific proposals. And so, you know, I think there's a latent need within the Open Referral community to maintain a conversation and do the work of you know, talking about like the data standard and also like data standards in general and how to do this stuff well. My worry, which I don't see a particular path to, but I just wanted to express, is that we're going to go through kind of a longer theoretical conversation without considering the very specific proposals for many months, which I know for you know, a number of projects that we're working on where we are trying to mash up a bunch of stakeholder data. You know, we really do want to use this 2. You know, whatever the Open Referral UK tools, you know, in Washington State, for example. You know, we do have 3 data sets that we do want to mash up. It's not, you know, Bristol data and New York City data that we want to mash up together, but, you know, real stakeholders who have, you know, multiple different data sets who we do want to mash together. And so, you know, I wonder if there are multiple tracks here that maybe we should consider around, you know, focused evaluation of specific recommendations versus kind of coming up with a broader, like Open Referral needs to have a community that is constantly improving the data standard and, you know, thinking about things properly to do that. I feel like both of those things are could be getting mashed into a single conversation, which will delay everything and also I think make things kind of vague around like what the goal of this, both goals, one being a persistent development of the standard and the other being getting 2.1 or whatever you want to call it, 3.0 out the door. So I'm just going to voice that. Thanks for listening to my little rant here.
Thank you, Devin. I think we are on a path that addresses that concern. When I'm talking about developing use cases, presumably those ideally are referencing real world needs that are emerging in our pilot projects, like those that you mentioned with regards to mashing data together, or you know, redeploying a tool that's been built in one place for another. Ideally, we want to take the time to understand those needs, to document them, potentially to weigh conflicting priorities in our decisions with regards to the specification. So I do think there are 2 tracks in front of us. One, we have proposals on the table. We want to hear any issues that you all have with those existing proposals. And we want to do a little bit of research and deliberation to make sure we're thinking about both practical and ideal scenarios in terms of what it is that people actually need, so that the issues that emerge in the first track can be checked against our assumptions as they're articulated in the second. So this points to specific homework for each of you all. Everybody, I'd expect to be, if you haven't read through these documents, like this is the time. By the next meeting, we want to identify any of your issues with these documents, any comments that you want to weigh in on what's specifically there. If we get no meaningful comments outside of these conceptual issues, then you know the conceptual issues become instructions for formalizing these proposals. And if we identify meaningful issues that people might not yet fully understand or you know might not be fully behind, then we've cut out our agenda for these conversations. We only have a few minutes left. I wanted to say I can follow up with everybody individually to see like who wants to be doing what, but we have at least two options for the cadence of this work group. One, the potential of like every other week we convene for an hour, potentially at this time, if it works for everybody, or potentially we only convene once a month, but it's a longer period of time, like 90 minutes or 2 hours. I don't know if we're going to be able to, if we have consensus on one of these things in this meeting, that's great. Otherwise, we will follow up and sort of poll you all. I'd welcome other proposals. I also assume that there will be breakout groups as needed if people want to discuss a specific thing and bring a more formal proposal to the group given this or that topic. People can form breakout groups according to your own autonomy. Any thoughts about like what you do or don't want to happen with regards to our cadence? Let's see, I'm looking in the chat. Interesting proposal emerging in the chat for, you know, implementing a 2.1 update and potentially, you know, proposing a longer 3.0 specification. That is something that I think could come out of this work group for sure. Any thoughts about the cadence? Like, does one or the other sound more or less appropriate to anybody in particular, or is it 6 in one hand and half dozen in the other for you?
To me, I'd like to meet relatively frequently, and those, if necessary, you know, break off into those more specialized groups, like one that looks at the methodology for the application profiles and one that looks at some of the changes, and maybe a separate one that fleshes out the use cases. So, you know, we can get that going quickly, and then we've got things going in parallel rather than having to wait for everything all the time.
Okay, so that's I'm seeing heads nodding around the idea of like every other week meeting for an hour and being intentional about having breakout groups that can get deep, because I know that an hour goes quickly on some of these complex topics, and my concern is that complex topics that we have only 10 or 15 minutes for, it might feel frustrating. But if people are being serious about having breakout groups that sort through specific complex issues and bring back what you're discussing, maybe this can work. So I'm seeing nods. I'm hoping that a bi-weekly cadence for this whole work group meeting, at least at an hour, is workable for you all. If somebody has to miss 1 or 2, that's okay, as long as we're sticking with 5 people per work group call. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to be following up with everybody as a group and also one-on-one. I would hope that we can find, I've sort of sketched out loosely what are the different use cases that I've heard so far at a high level. It was like, what is it people want to do? I hope that at least one person will volunteer for each one of these to work with me and or others in documenting a 1 or 2 page use case, or maybe longer, that describes your needs and thinks about how those might be generally relevant to accompany your contributions of responses to the proposals that are documented and linked above. Okay, we're at time. Sorry for going right up to the hour and not having some time for a final set of closing thoughts, but I think this is a really good start. Thank you all for your time. Thank you all for the time you're about to give and for your insights. And please, by all means, share your feedback with me and the technical stewards and secretariat to help us think through how we can make sure that this is the most efficient and effective use of your time as subject matter experts and stakeholders. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.